Hello everyone. This video is about pruning tomato plants, but before you touch any of those suckers, there are a couple of things you need to know, and I'll cover each of them in this video. First, I'll talk about the reasons we prune. Some reasons are obvious, some not so obvious. Next, we'll talk about the proper tool to use to minimize damage to the plant. Third, we will discuss the variety of tomato plant you are growing and how that matters in pruning. Fourth, the heat and humidity in your growing zone may affect some of your pruning choices. And last, at the end of the growing season, as we are nearing the fall frost date, you might want to do some extra pruning to help speed up the ripening process. So let's start with the first item on the list. Why prune tomato plants? If left to grow on their own, they will most likely produce fruit, but the plants will probably fall to the ground under the weight of all its stems and leaves and fruit. Once it is sprawling on the ground, you will probably get pests and diseases along with that fruit. If done properly, pruning helps increase airflow around the plant to discourage pests and diseases from growing. With better airflow, the leaves can dry faster after a rain since you don't have moisture accumulating. Also, when the leaves are less dense, it's easier to see the insects that might be harming your plants, and then you can take care of it before it gets worse. Another reason for pruning is to allow the plant to direct its energy towards fruit production rather than making more leaves. You will probably have less fruit on a pruned plant, but the fruit will be bigger and you can plant more tomato plants closer together if you keep them pruned. The plants will grow taller using more vertical space. Of course, you would have to stake them properly, and that will free up the horizontal space for more plants, which makes up for less tomatoes on each plant, but it gives you more room to plant more. I'll talk more about pruning techniques in a bit, but first let's take a look at what tool you should use for pruning. And the tool is a pruner. Some people call it clippers. Pruners are on the small side of gardening tools. They are made to be used with one hand to trim smaller branches and stems. No more than 1 inch in diameter, but usually only about ½ inch wide. There are several types of pruners. Typically, people have what are called bypass pruners, anvil pruners, and or garden scissors. Most of these pruners have a spring action which opens the blades after each cut. Some have a ratcheting mechanism, which is good if you have a weaker wrist. The recommended type of pruner for living stems is the bypass pruner. A bypass pruner has 2 curved blades that move past each other. In other words, they bypass each other. One blade is sharp and the other is thicker and not sharp. Bypass pruners are recommended for pruning live stems on tomato plants because they'll give the cleanest cuts with the least tissue damage to the plant. You might see anvil pruners. These have a straight blade that cuts onto a flat edge and are not recommended for pruning tomato plants. Rather than making the clean cut bypass pruners give, the anvil will crush the soft live stems and you'll end up with a messy cut that can weaken the plant and open it up to infection. Anvil pruners are best used on dead wood. Speaking of infection, it is a good idea to clean your pruning shears after you're finished using them for the day, and also to give it a wipe with alcohol before pruning. This can help prevent the spread of any diseases or infection. The last thing I'll say about the pruners is that they should have some sort of lock mechanism to secure the blades after cutting. That's not to protect the plants, that's to protect you or any others who might be around. Don't leave the pruners open, latch them closed after you use them. Now that we have the proper tool, we are ready to prune. But first we have to talk about the differences between indeterminate and determinate tomato plants. You should know what type of plant you have. It is normally listed on the seed packet or on the plant if you bought it. I have 4 varieties of tomatoes in my raised garden, 2 indeterminate, the Big Daddy and the Super Sweet 100s, and I also have 2 determinate varieties, the Bush Steak and the Roma tomatoes. They have different growing habits, and that affects how we prune them. If you have indeterminate plants, they will continue to grow and set fruit until they are killed off by the fall frost. When people talk about pruning their tomato plants, they are usually referring to indeterminate varieties, since these are the ones that need the most attention when pruning. Determinate varieties are different. The plant grows to a certain genetically determined height, depending on the variety. They set all their fruit in a short period of time, and then they die. These plants should not be pruned much, if at all. You would want to trim off the lower leaves of determinate plants to keep soil-borne diseases from splashing up into the leaves. So trim away any leaves that are touching the soil or near it. You might also want to remove some of the leaves from the center of a determinate plant to help increase the airflow. But be careful not to remove too many leaves, and don't remove leaves if they are directly above or below a fruit cluster. It's believed that the leaves nearest to a fruit cluster are the ones that send sugar to it, and of course the leaves above the fruit cluster help to shade it from the sun. If the sun burns the skin of a tomato, you get what is called sun scald. Back to indeterminate plants, they grow and can become unruly if not staked properly and pruned. But there are many other reasons for pruning indeterminate plants, aside from keeping the garden neat and tidy. I mentioned some of these earlier. Pruning tomato plants allows for better airflow around the plant, which helps in many ways. Mostly it helps to prevent diseases. But pruning is also very helpful if you're in a climate with a short growing season, since pruned tomato plants tend to ripen faster. This is because they have less tomatoes growing. With fewer fruits for the plant to take care of, the fruit should ripen faster. Actually, these plants were first pruned when they were transplanted into the ground. At that time, I removed all the lower leaves and buried the plant as deep into the ground as I could. At the beginning of the growing season, if this is an indeterminate plant, you should remove any flowers the plant might produce until the plant is between 12 and 18 inches tall. This allows the plant to direct more energy to the roots. Once you have a cluster of fruits, make sure to remove all the suckers beneath that cluster so it won't slow down the development of those tomatoes. Here you can see what a sucker is. These are little shoots growing in the armpit of the plant, between where the branch is and the main stem. Some people remove all the branches of indeterminate tomato plants and grow only on the main stem. In colder growing zones, this may be fine, and it does produce larger tomatoes, but if you're in a warmer growing zone, you will want to keep some of the leaves to help shade the tomatoes from sun scald, which is like a sunburn for tomatoes. Keeping parts of the suckers is called the Missouri pruning technique. You pinch off most of the sucker, but not all. You leave the lower two leaves of the sucker to provide shade for the tomatoes below it. The leaves act as an umbrella or parasol for the tomatoes. So you're probably thinking, how much should I prune? For determinate plants, the answer is easy. Prune very little, usually only on the bottom. But for indeterminate plants, there are many different schools of thought, from keeping a few branches to pruning down to only one main stem. If you prune all the branches and just let the tomatoes grow off the main stem, then you will have fewer but larger tomatoes. If you let the plant have some branches, then you will have more fruit, but they will be smaller. Whatever you decide, make sure not to prune the growing tip, unless it's the end of the season and you want to force the plant to go into ripening mode. More about that in a minute. But other than the growing tip, you can prune the side branches of an indeterminate plant as much as you want. Just leave the main stem alone. Or you can allow the plant to branch out and only prune enough to give a good airflow around the plant. And of course, the bottom leaves should always be pruned to about a foot off the ground. That brings us to the topic of pruning at the end of the growing season. As you are approaching the fall frost date, you may find you have lots of tomatoes on the plants, but they're all green. With the expected frost date coming, you really want to speed up the ripening process. If you don't know your fall frost date, you can go to www.almanac.com/gardening/frost dates and enter your zip code, and the website will give you the expected fall frost date. My fall frost date is October 16, so as I'm nearing that date, I might want to speed up the ripening process. One way to do this is to top off the plant. This stops the plant from growing more. It will stop flowering and setting new fruit, and then it should direct its energy to ripening the remaining fruit. To top off the plant, you just prune the growing tip about 4 weeks before the fall frost date, and now you've stopped the plant from growing, and it can concentrate on putting its energy into ripening the fruits that are on the vine. Remember, determinate plants should be pruned sparingly, only the lower leaves that touch the ground and any that look diseased. You can prune suckers below the first cluster of flowers, but try not to touch anything above that first cluster. For indeterminate plants, you can prune as much as you want, down to a single main stem if you wish. You should remove all the stems below the first cluster of fruit, and if you decide to grow a multi-stem plant, then try to keep it down to 3 or 4 stems aside from the main stem. The less stems the plant has, the bigger the fruit will be, but there will be less fruit. It's your choice. I think that covers most of what you need to know about pruning. Tomato plants are tough plants and they almost always produce a harvest, even if you don't prune properly. So experiment. Keep a journal so you know what works for you, and enjoy the fruits of your labor. Please comment below and share your experiences and growing tips, and thank you for watching. Bye!